I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I just stood there in the middle of that Costco parking lot in Mississauga, holding a bag of groceries in each hand, while my husband told me he was leaving me for my sister. He said it the way you'd tell someone the weather had changed. My sister had been living with us for 4 months. She'd come to stay after her lease in Hamilton ran out, said she needed a few weeks to get back on her feet. I'd made her a key. I'd stocked the second bathroom with her favorite shampoo. I'd told my husband, I remember saying this specifically, she's family, treat her like family. I suppose he took that very literally. His name doesn't matter anymore. I've started thinking of him only as my ex-husband, because that's all he is now. But back then, standing under those gray November clouds with my hands going numb from the cold plastic bags, he was still the person I'd spent 11 years building a life with. He was still the man whose back I'd rubbed when he had a kidney stone at 2 in the morning. He was still the man who had cried, actually cried, at our wedding in that little vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. He told me my sister was pregnant, 3 months along. I set the grocery bags down on the pavement very carefully so the eggs wouldn't break. Then I got in the passenger side of our car and I looked straight ahead through the windshield and I said, I'd like to go home now. He drove us home in silence. I did not cry until he was in the shower, and even then I turned on the kitchen tap so he wouldn't hear me. That was the beginning. The people who knew us assumed I would fall apart. My mother called every day for 2 weeks, and every day I could hear the worry beneath her questions. How are you eating? Are you sleeping? Do you want me to come stay with you? My friends from work dropped off casseroles. My neighbor, a retired nurse who'd seen everything, brought me a bottle of Cab Franc from her cellar and said, drink this slowly and don't make any decisions for 6 months. What none of them understood was that I wasn't falling apart. I was getting very, very quiet. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives when the worst thing happens. You stop wasting energy on hope or on dread. Everything becomes sharp and clean. I'd spent 11 years being the person who kept things together, managing the household, managing the finances, managing my husband's fluctuating moods and my sister's fluctuating crises, and in a strange way, the moment it all collapsed, I finally felt the weight lift. I'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and now I didn't have to anymore. My ex-husband had his own financial planning practice, small but profitable, about 18 clients, mostly business owners and a handful of high-net-worth retirees in the Oakville area. I had done his bookkeeping for the first 4 years, before my own career in corporate accounting had grown too demanding to allow it. I knew how his business worked. I knew his software, his file structure, his billing cycles. I knew which clients had the most complex portfolios, and which ones barely looked at their quarterly statements. I mention this because it becomes important later. After he left, after the lawyers got involved and the house went on the market and my sister stopped returning my calls, I threw myself into my job with the kind of focus that probably alarmed my manager. I was handling audit prep for a mid-sized manufacturing company headquartered in Burlington, and I was good at it. I was precise. I noticed things other people missed. It had always been my professional reputation. I find discrepancies. About 7 months after my ex-husband left, I found one. It wasn't in my own company's books. It was in a file I shouldn't have had access to at all, except that my ex-husband, in the chaos of dividing our shared digital accounts, had forgotten to remove me from the cloud backup linked to his business laptop. I discovered this by accident. I was trying to log into my old CRA account and his practices folder appeared in a shared drive I hadn't opened in years. I want to be clear, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't planning anything. I was tired and I was lonely and I was clicking through old files because my apartment felt very empty, and sometimes looking at spreadsheets makes me feel less alone. That's just the kind of person I am. But I opened the folder because the date stamp caught my eye. Files had been modified recently, within the past 3 months, and when I looked at what had been modified, I felt the hair on my arms stand up. He had been moving money, not his money, his client's money. I'm not going to use the word embezzlement loosely. I'm an accountant. I understand the specific legal definition, but what I saw in those files described a pattern of unauthorized transfers, small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags, large enough to accumulate into something substantial. Over what appeared to be a period of approximately 14 months, somewhere in the range of $600,000, had been redirected from 4 client accounts into a numbered company registered in Alberta that I had never seen referenced in any of his legitimate business records. I sat with my laptop open for a long time that evening, The sky went dark outside my window. I made a cup of tea and let it go cold. Then I called a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, a different kind. He and my sister had moved into a house in Burlington, a rental, because the proceeds from our sold home had been divided, and neither of us had enough alone for a down payment in this market. She was 8 months pregnant by then. She had texted me once, in the early weeks, a message that said simply, "I'm sorry, but we couldn't help it." I had read it 3 times and then archived it without responding. There was nothing to say to that. You don't apologize for something you couldn't help, and then keep doing it for 3 months before telling anyone. My mother, to her credit, was furious with my sister. She told me so on one of our calls, quietly furious in the way our family expressed strong emotion, which mostly looked like tight silences and very controlled sentences. She knew what she was doing, my mother said. She knew the whole time. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The baby was born in January. A girl. My ex-husband sent me a group text. I was apparently still on some distribution list from his contacts, with a photograph. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. The baby had a lot of dark hair and was making the face that all newborns make, that slightly offended expression, as though arrival itself was an indignity. My sister looked exhausted and bewildered. My ex-husband was grinning. I deleted the text and went to bed. Here is something people don't tell you about quiet women. We are not passive. Quiet is not the same as inactive. While everyone around me was managing their concern for my well-being, and while my ex-husband was presumably celebrating the new chapter of his life, I was working. I was building something. The lawyer I had contacted put me in touch with a forensic accountant, a woman who worked out of a small firm in downtown Toronto, brusque and efficient and exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the numbers don't add up. We spent 3 months going through everything I had access to, documenting the pattern, timestamping the transfers, identifying the numbered company and tracing it back. We also found something else. The numbered company in Alberta had a second shareholder, not my ex-husband. A name I didn't recognize at first, and then, when I looked it up, I recognized it very well. It was the name of a client. Specifically, it was the name of one of his older clients, a man in his 70s who had been with my ex-husband's practice since before I had ever come into the picture. A man who, according to those modified files, had not only authorized transfers into the numbered company, but had been receiving regular payments back out of it. Not all the money was being stolen by my ex-husband alone. They were running it together, and that changed things significantly. Because it meant the transactions had a more complicated legal character. It meant there were 2 parties to pursue, 2 sets of records, and critically, it meant that when the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario began its own investigation, which it did several months later after I had filed a detailed complaint with supporting documentation, the scope of what they uncovered was much larger than $600,000. I only know the final figure because my lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring and said, in her perfectly level voice, "They've confirmed the total. Just over 2.3 million. I was standing in my kitchen making pasta. I set down the wooden spoon. I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes, thank you for letting me know." Then I ate my pasta and watched Ansat's news and went to bed at 10 o'clock. The criminal process moved at the speed that criminal processes move, which is to say slowly and without regard for anyone's emotional timeline. I had a divorce to finalize in the meantime, and that moved at its own slow pace. My ex-husband had a lawyer who was aggressive and fond of delay tactics, and there were months of back and forth about asset division, support arrangements, all of it. At some point during this process, my ex-husband must have become aware that there was a regulatory investigation involving his practice. Because his lawyer's tone shifted. They became less aggressive. They became, in fact, somewhat accommodating. We reached a settlement in September. I am not going to disclose the specific terms because the agreement has a confidentiality clause. What I will say is that by the time everything was accounted for, the equity in the house, the retirement savings, certain business assets, I was not left in the position I might have been. I was, in fact, in a position that a lawyer friend of mine described as pretty solid, all things considered. My ex-husband's practice lost its registration. He was not immediately criminally charged. These things take time, and the co-investor's involvement complicated the timeline, but the investigation was ongoing, and ongoing investigations tend to resolve in particular ways. I moved back to Toronto, a condo near St. Lawrence Market with a view of the lake if you lean a specific way from the bedroom window. It was more than I had expected to be able to afford at this stage of my life, and I spent the first week going from room to room just because I could. Just because it was mine and no one else's. My sister called me in October. First time in almost a year. I saw her name on my screen and I let it ring through to voicemail. She left a message. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking and she wanted to explain, and that things with, and here she said his name, which I still don't use, had been difficult, and she thought maybe we could talk. I listened to the message twice. Then I saved it, because my lawyer had advised me to keep records of any contact, and then I went to make coffee. I didn't call her back. Here is what I want you to understand about where I was by that point. I was not angry. I had been angry, but anger is expensive. It costs you sleep and appetite, and the ability to concentrate on things that matter. Sometime around month 4, I had made a practical decision to put the anger somewhere and let it sit, and focus instead on the things I could control. The accounting, the documentation, the settlement, the apartment. What I had now was something quieter and more durable than anger. I had clarity. I had a good apartment and a better-paying job, and a savings account that was growing steadily, and I had the knowledge that I had handled an extraordinary amount of difficulty with a great deal of precision, and that this said something about who I was. My mother came to visit in November and we cooked dinner together in my new kitchen, and she said very quietly, "I'm proud of you." Not for surviving, she's not sentimental that way. She meant something more specific. She meant for not becoming something ugly in the process. I understood that. The winter was the first winter in 11 years that I spent entirely alone, and it was also the first winter in 11 years that I slept through the night without worrying about someone else's problems. I read books I'd been meaning to read. I signed up for a pottery class badly and quit after 3 sessions and felt completely fine about it. I got up on Saturday mornings and made proper breakfasts, eggs and sourdough from the bakery on King Street, and sat by the window with my coffee and watched the city below. Small things. But they were mine. In March, something happened that I did not anticipate. I received a phone call from a woman I had never met. Her name wasn't familiar and her voice was guarded, hesitant. She introduced herself carefully, said she'd gotten my contact through a mutual connection, said she was one of my ex-husband's former clients. Said she'd been trying to understand what had happened to certain funds and had hit walls at every turn, and someone, she wouldn't say who, had suggested I might be able to help her understand the timeline. I asked her how old she was. She said 71. I asked her if she had a family member who could sit with her while we spoke. She said her daughter was there. I said, "All right, let me tell you what I know." I spoke with her for 2 hours. I was careful. I shared only what was already part of the documented record. Nothing covered by my own confidentiality agreement, nothing prejudicial. But I answered her questions honestly and completely, and by the end of the call she was crying a little, the quiet kind of crying, and she said, "I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining it." I said, "You weren't imagining it." She said, "Thank you for picking up." I thought about that call for a long time afterward, about the particular loneliness of feeling like you've been deceived and not being able to prove it, about how much it matters to have someone say, "I see it too, it's real." My ex-husband's formal charges came through in June. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, several others that I won't recite here. His co-investor, the elderly client, had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a lesser arrangement, which meant that the documented record against my ex-husband was thorough and sourced. His lawyer, I'm told, advised him to expect a realistic outcome. My sister and he had separated by then. I learned this not from Herver but from my mother, who mentioned it with studied casualness, in a way that told me she had been sitting on the information for a while, choosing her moment. Apparently the relationship had not withstood the pressure of a new baby, a regulatory investigation, and the particular strain of knowing that the man in your life had been quietly defrauding people for over a year. People are surprising, or perhaps they're not. Perhaps they're exactly what circumstances reveal them to be. My niece is 18 months old now. I have not met her. This is a strange thing to carry. She is not responsible for any of it, and she is family, and I don't entirely know yet what the right thing is. My mother has met her, carefully, quietly, in the way my mother navigates everything. She says the baby looks like our grandmother, which made me feel something I wasn't expecting. Not warmth, exactly. Something more complicated, something still in progress. I don't have a resolution about my sister yet. I think I might be working toward one, slowly. I think forgiveness is something that happens incrementally and usually without announcement, and I'm not there yet, but I think I'm in motion. What I can say with certainty is that my feelings about her are no longer clean and simple. They're not pure anger, not pure grief. They're something murkier and more human, which is probably how they should be. My ex-husband I have fewer complicated feelings about. The clarity came faster there, and I think that's because what he did was more legible to me. He deceived his clients. He deceived me. He deceived the regulatory systems designed to protect ordinary people who trusted him with their retirement savings. There was nothing in that requiring nuance. There was only the slow, careful process of ensuring consequences. I still work in corporate accounting. I got a promotion in August. Senior controller, which means more responsibility and more interesting problems, which is mostly what I was after. My manager, when she told me, said, "You've earned this. The way you handled the Bramwell audit last year, that was exactly what we needed." She didn't know about any of the rest of it. She was only talking about my work. But I thought about the audit, about the way I had sat with those files and not panicked, about the particular skill of remaining calm when the numbers tell you something you don't want to hear. I have always been good in a crisis. I used to apologize for it. There's something that feels cold about composure, something that can read as absence of feeling. I'm not cold. I feel things deeply and for a long time, but I've learned that feeling deeply and managing carefully are not opposites. They are, in fact, the combination that keeps you standing when everything else goes sideways. I'm 38 years old. I live alone in a city I chose, in a neighborhood I love, in an apartment I can actually afford. On Sunday mornings, I walk to the market and buy whatever looks good and come home and cook. I call my mother on Wednesday evenings. I have a small group of friends, not large, never was, who know me well and don't require me to perform. I did not come out of the last 2 years the same person I was going in, but I think that's true of most things worth surviving. You get to be a different person on the other side, ideally a sharper one. Ideally one who trusts their own instincts a little more, who is a little less inclined to mistake generosity for obligation, who has learned that keeping a person's favorite shampoo stocked in your second bathroom does not guarantee they will act like family. The view from my bedroom window, if you lean the right way, is the lake. In winter it goes gray and flat, almost indistinguishable from the sky. In summer it turns a particular shade of blue that I have not found the right word for yet. I am in no hurry, I have time.